Wild Magic Surge is my favorite mechanic in all of Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, but Rules as Written has 5 big problems I have 5 homebrew fixes for that you can pick and choose from to use for yourself. I'm gonna surge through all the tips and give you all a sneak peek at my own personal, custom made from scratch D300 Wild Magic Surge table, and I'll let you know how you can get your hands on it. I've been working on it for years and it's finally ready. Here we go. I'm gonna start off with the first and smallest issue that I have with the Rules as Written Wild Magic Surge D100 table. Isn't actually a D100 table, it's a D50 table, disguised as a D100 table because it double dips and pairs 2 numbers up for each of them. Now I know I might be a little biased with this because it is my favorite mechanic and all, but at D50 it just isn't enough, I feel like, because if you have a wild magic sorcerer or you use magic items that involve wild magic, which we'll get to in a second, then I feel like there's a lot of potential for overlaps or repeat uses. And maybe I also say this because I've had this literally happen to me before and we're like, wait, that effects happened before. So really, I just love it so much, I want more of them. So moving on to the second tip now is some of the actual effects in the 50 that they give you are just a little weird to me and a little off. I know this is a lot to ask, but I want every single time a wild magic surge happens for it to be really cool and memorable. It can also be funny and strange or even ominous, and I like the feeling of this huge energy surge happening, but then nothing seems to happen. What just happened? And I feel like I can say this because I did this not only 50 times, but 300 times. So I really want more out of each of these things. So here's some examples from the Rules as Written table that just fell flat for me. If you roll a 53 or 54, now you cannot be intoxicated by alcohol for 5d6 days. I guess this might be another issue, but I don't know how I would describe that as a DM if they're in the middle of combat and this happens and that's the thing that I read on the table. What would I say to that player? Or if they're in the middle of some sort of role play situation, that's just weird to me. And you roll 5d6 and then that player might not even drink alcohol. It's just weird. And another one of these effects that could have no effect at all, especially this one's in combat, is if you roll a 21 or a 22, the next saving throw that your target makes on a spell you cast against it is at disadvantage. So again, I don't know what I would say, and that's not the most epic thing to describe to the player when the surge happens and that they now have to make trigger a saving throw on an enemy. But what if they are just going to cast spell attacks? It wouldn't do anything. And I also don't like with wild magic surges that I have to describe to the player, oh yeah, now this is what you can do with your spell, and it's not as immersive and like magical. Or what about if you roll a 71 or 72, you gain resistance to all damage you take within the next 1 minute. But what if you're not in combat when this thing happens and you're not even taking damage? If you're a sorcerer and you're staying far back, then you might not even take damage even if you're in combat. This example leads me right into the next point. If you roll a 59 or a 60, it refills your lowest level spell slot that you've used. And leading me into point number 3 is I don't want this table to be exclusively used for spellcasters and specifically wild magic sorcerers. I want my wild magic table to be a wild magic table, not a wild magic sorcerer table. If you want to use wild magic as an effect that you want to give to an item or a curse that you want to put on a player, you now can't do that because some of the ones on the table, and there's multiple of them, wouldn't work. And I just did an entire live stream over Wild Magic Surge and how I use it, and we created a bunch of Wild Magic Surge items that you can use and give to any player, not just spellcasters, because the table that I created isn't just exclusive to Wild Magic Sorcerers or casters in general. I want a fighter to be able to roll on the Wild Magic Surge table and have all of the effects work. It just makes the Wild Magic Surge table far more useful if you can use it for more things. My 4th issue here, and I feel like I've said more than 4 issues already at this point, but the Wild Magic random table is too specific. You'll really see what I mean by this when I talk about how I use Wild Magic Surge and how general it is, because whenever you have these random effects happening at random points in your game, you don't want to be too specific with whatever the duration is or how much damage is done, because depending on how early on in the level or how later in the campaign or whatever it is you're doing, you don't want to be too pigeonholed into one thing and the resistance lasts for 1 minute. Maybe it lasts a whole day. And if you just freaked out a little because I said I was going to give a player resistance to all damage for a day, what if they're not in combat? And what if they never even triggers and they don't feel the resistance from that wild magic surge that just happened? So I can have the effect last for as long as I want to as the DM, because it's free and open and you can do whatever you want with it. And then as soon as the damage triggers 24 hours later, the magic's gone. Basically what I'm saying here is every time that Wild Magic Surge triggers, I want my players to feel it. And if the duration that the rules as written thing said isn't long enough, then I would want you to make it longer. Or if something was going on too long and the player was really feeling bogged down by it and the effect was wearing on them or it was too much, I'd want to be able to cut it off sooner. So I want to empower those DMs out there whenever you use my Wild Magic Surge table or any of them, is to be free to cut off those durations and extend them and change them for what feels right for your game. The fifth and biggest problem I have is there is no sliding scale of good and bad to this Wild Magic Surge table. What I mean by this is it is truly and absolutely random. And I do get that. That's cool. Of course, I love it. But whenever you roll that D100 and the players at the table see the D100 on the table, they don't care what that number is because it's random. They could roll a 100 out of 100 and it's no more good or bad than another roll. So the fact that it's purely random means it disengages the rest of the players at the table. Whenever I ask the player to roll on the whatever Wild Magic Surge table and they roll the number, I want the players to look at that number and be like, oh, what is it? But if it's purely random, then no one cares and they're just going to sit back and wait for the DM to read off whenever they finally look it up on the list. But if there is a sense in some way to this good and bad that I'll talk about how I handled it in a second, then the players see that, ooh, there's something good that's about to happen. I'm excited. Ooh, there's something bad that's about to happen. It gives them some sort of engagement and involvement with whatever the dice roll was. Okay, I've complained enough now, but I feel like I can because this is truly my favorite mechanic in all of Dungeons and Dragons and it hits home to me so much. Now I'm going to fix it. How I address this is going to be with the trigger of what causes the Wild Magic Surge, a delay of some kind where whenever the effect is triggered, maybe it happens right away or maybe not. And then the damage or DC of whatever set of how bad is this thing or how hard is this thing to resist. Then duration's a huge one that I talked about just a little bit. We're going to dive all the way into. And then finally, I'm going to give you guys a sneak peek at how I run my table and exact examples from my table that you kind of see what I'm talking about. The first one's simple. It's the trigger. What sparks this Wild Magic Surge? Now, when you're thinking about wild magic items, there's a ton of different options about if you roll a nat 1 or you roll a nat 20 or you combat starts and a Wild Magic Surge happens. Whatever happens to start the Wild Magic Surge, that's going to be its own thing. But if you're talking specifically about a Wild Magic Sorcerer, it's very clear what causes Wild Magic Surges to happen, especially with that subclass. But sneak peek for next week, I have an entire complete fix to the Wild Magic Sorcerer because there's so many things about that class. It is my favorite, second favorite subclass in the entire game, and I just feel like it falls a little flat. I'm going to go into that next week, so I'm not going to even start now. But basically, whether it's a subclass that you're dealing with that has mechanics to it or a magic item, what triggers it is something you need to be able to lay out. This trigger can also tie directly into the second thing, which is the delay. Now, most of the time, whenever Wild Magic Surge triggers, the effect happens immediately. But sometimes, as the DM, I want to have wiggle room to be able to. It wouldn't make sense for that to happen right now. So maybe I describe some huge burst of energy, explosion, but nothing happens and the character's left arm is glowing. Why is my left arm glowing? They don't know. And now this thing that would be just random or whatever was going to happen from the surge is now something mysterious. And maybe I can choose to trigger it and have the actual trigger happen, like we talked about a second ago, whenever I want or whenever would make more sense to make that Wild Magic Surge effect cooler. Maybe the effect that was going to happen is some sort of combat effect that I now want to hold on to, and they have this passive innate energy surging within them, and the next attack that they land triggers it. Or if you really want to mess with your player's mind, have it be 24 hours exactly, and then it triggers out of nowhere. Now, these tips you can use for any Wild Magic Surge table. It doesn't have to be for mine. You can use these tips with the rules as written table as well. I feel like it will make the table feel better. So third tip now is going into the damage and DC, Dungeon Coach DC, of each of these things. I don't like that there's specific damage numbers for these things, because if you have a fireball trigger and you have a group of level 1 characters and the Wild Magic Surge triggers, everyone's dead. Now the Wild Magic Surge that was supposed to be this really fun random thing just killed the entire party. But if there's one person by themselves with a whole bunch of enemies and all the rest of the party's far enough away, sure, I might have the full damage trigger and it'd be some massive explosion. It kills everything and himself in the process. And now the players have to run over and try and bring him back. Now, I will admit, yes, this is more of an advanced DM move here to be able to come up with damage on the fly, but there's a chart on most Dungeon Master screens that has an improvised damage chart that would be huge, especially for new Dungeon Masters, to be able to assign damage on the fly for level 17 players or level 1 characters. And the same thing also applies applies to any type of saving throws or whatever the DC would be. If this effect that's happening is in this huge big moment, maybe I have the DC be really high so that it actually hits the players. Or if it's this really negative effect and it's early on in a campaign, I can lower it down to 12. If you're picking up what I'm putting down and you see the big picture, it's all about flexibility, which leads me to a fourth point about duration. How long do these things last? I do not want to put that in the Wild Magic Surge table. If you feel like this is cheating as the DM or whatever, then sure, you can assign some sort of hours or minutes or a day or whatever, permanent even. Oh, that's crazy. And I do think that that's crazy to randomly assign durations to these things and then enforce them super strictly, because that just doesn't feel right. The fire resist example I gave earlier, if I had it be 1 minute, it could not affect them at all, and then they wondered what that surge was in the first place. Or I could have it last until the next time they take damage, and then they get resistance, and then the magic's gone. That feels way better than 1 minute. Oh, sorry, it says 1 minute. 1 minute's up. Lame. Maybe if the player that triggered this Wild Magic Surge and get this crazy, huge, awesome buff that they can now do something, or they have access to a new ability or something crazy, let it be permanent for a little while. Maybe it's permanent for a couple sessions, and then the next time something happens, or the next time they drop below half health, or the next time they take lightning damage, whatever, it's gone. They got a taste of that power, then you take it away. Because just maybe it would make that player want something like that more, and maybe do some role play things to figure out where that magic came from or how they could access things like that. Because that's literally happened to my table before. And on the other end of things, if there's a really negative effect and I see that this has happened and I look at the table result and like, oh man, that would be really bad, and I leave it on the player and let it be permanent and something that they now have to figure out. And maybe they have side quests that they have to figure out what this curse, this wild magic curse is on them now, to release it from them. This whole process is just way better and feels way better than strictly like a robot issuing out the random numbers they chose for durations in the table. Which is why in my D300 table, there are no durations. And now for that biggest problem, here's my homebrew fix for it, is I want my players to roll that dice and be excited about the number that hits the table. So for my D300 table of how I chose to handle it, whenever you roll for it, you have a D100 and a D20, because you gotta love the D20, and you roll both of them. The D100 works just like how you'd expect it. There's 100 different rows on my table, and it goes to which one of those 100 rows you randomly go to. So that's the randomness that I feel like should definitely be in a Wild Magic Surge table. But what about the D20? The D20 represents, like what it does in a lot of D&D, the highs and the lows, the good and the bad. And this is where the 300 comes in for my D300 table. You have 100 different rows, but you have 3 different columns of bad, good, and neutral. So you roll that D20, and if you roll a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, 25% chance, math people out there, that is a bad result, and it will always be a bad result because it's in the bad result column. But the opposite is also true. If you roll a 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 25% chance something good will always happen because you only pick options from the good column. And that middle column is that neutral 50% column for sometimes good, sometimes bad, but mostly neutral effects. Timeout. So if this sounds cool to you and you want to get this Wild Magic Surge table and use it at your table, here's how you do it. And at the time of filming this video, there's already 300 of you that know about this and already have it right now yourselves. Any of these huge projects that I do and put years of work into, because trust me, these 300 things being all good ones, each one of these I've curated personally and gone through multiple iterations of to give to you guys, and I want to give it to the people who support me the most. If you didn't know by now, every single month I give out monthly PDFs to all of my patrons, and at the tier 1 $5 level, you're able to get access to this entire D300 spreadsheet, and there's even more beyond that. Because technically I actually make 3 PDFs every single month, and the tier 2 PDF for those people who choose that reward tier gets the tier 1 PDF of all the Wild Magic Surge table goodness, and you actually get a bunch of Wild Magic Surge items, ways I use it at my table, different rule tips of how you can implement Wild Magic Surge tables that go beyond this. And tier 3 was so fun to do because I love, like I said, Wild Magic Surge Sorcerers and Wild Magic Barbarians, but I took 4 more classes and gave them Wild Magic Surge subclasses. But I'll save what all those are about for next week's video because they're really cool. Any patron during the month of January can go on Patreon right now and download it for yourself. But if this is after January and in the future or whatever, you can still get it, and I'm going to try and have links in the description of how I'm going to be able to go and do that. But the cheapest way to pick it up is always going to be through Patreon. It just works out best for me, and I can lower the price on it to save you money, and we both win. Because let's get back to these examples. I'm really excited to share these with you guys, and keep in mind, there's 300 of these things, but I want to give you guys a sneak peek of how I created these things and the general themes of them as well. Because another thing I didn't say is my entire Wild Magic Surge table is organized by the different schools of magic: transmutation, abjuration, necromancy. And that also adds some cool flavor things you can do with the different schools of magic. But anyway, number 20, if you roll a 20 on that D100, here are the 3 different columns for bad, neutral, and good. If you roll a 1 through 5 on that D20, you get the bad only result, which is you now cannot speak, and anytime you open your mouth, bubbles come out. I chose this example because this is actually also in the rules as written, where you can't speak and bubbles come out. But I actually progressed this thing from bad to good, because if you roll a 6 through 15 for that middle 50%, now you must only shout when you speak. That would be really annoying, but you see how no speech ties into, and it's like connected. And that theme is what I tried to do with all of these things. When you roll that D100, it's going to get you some sort of thing having to do with each other, which I also thought was a cool touch. But if you roll a 16 through 20, now you can speak telepathically. So you literally go from not speaking to dumbly speaking to then just telepathically speaking. Let's do it again for if you roll a 30. Your character gains 100 pounds instantly and halves your movement. Now that would be an example of something that's really detrimental to a character, whether it's their own body image of what they want to see their character. They don't want to see that, that feel that part of their character, or if it's the half movement speed in combat, they're slower. You can have, and I didn't say any duration on that, you can have it be as long or as little as you want. You could have it be something they have to actually lose weight and work it on down. Hey, New Year's resolution right here too. Or you can have it be something that's only during combat or only for a minute or however long that lasts. It's something that they feel it, they get the, whatever humor or effect from it, and then it's gone. I love the neutral one on this is you must move at full speed anytime you go anywhere. So again, there's not really any mechanical benefits unless you're trying to sneak really slowly. But if you're going anywhere, you can only full sprint there. I'm just imagining something simple like the players going into a tavern and this character that has this effect has to sprint to the barkeep and then sprint to the table. Or for the good result on this one, I have it that you double your movement speed and you can now dash as a bonus action. Here's another reason why I wanted to use this as an example, so that the DMs out there that have this and use this can think outside the box, because that's very powerful to double movement speed and dash at the quadruple. That's crazy. So I would only have this be a very short effect if this was happening in combat, maybe a full round of combat, or maybe just 2 rounds or something. But if you wanted this to be something cool to give your player permanently, maybe they gain 10 feet of movement speed and they can now dash as a bonus action. Or they can just now dash as a bonus action, and that's something permanent that their character unlocked through this cool magic surge effect. Or you describe a rush of energy that flows into their legs, and now you tell them increase your movement speed on your character sheet by 10 feet. Even if you said 5 feet, that'd be a really cool thing that now you permanently have. Or maybe it's not permanent, or maybe it has some drawbacks to it. You can run with this thing and have it become something really cool. I have a bunch of different effects about teleporting to different planes of existence. They could give some cool things about going to somewhere and seeing something happen, and maybe they have to try and survive before they get pulled back for some duration that you choose as the DM. Or there's some divination properties where you see into the future, or you see into the past, and can use these wild magic surges as a plot device to be able to get across some story hooks or some foreshadowing. Or a more deadly example is 86. On a bad result, you permanently bubble in a death saving throw. Now, when I say permanently, keep in mind the whole duration thing. Maybe it's only for a short period of time, but I really do like this one for something they have to figure out how to undo. And if you see where I'm going with this whole thematic thing, is on the other side for the good, you permanently bubble in a success on a death saving throw. And on that middle one, for the neutral effect, I would tell the player, make a death saving throw, and whatever that result was is what they'd bubble in. I also really wanted to make a 1 on that D100 and a 100 on that D100. Really exciting things. But I don't know if I should tell you. Okay, I'm not going to do that. I'll tell you, if you roll a D100, the bad result is the DM actually rolls behind their screen secretly a D100 and sees what a bad result would be. And they write that down, they remember that, and they trigger that whenever they want to at the worst moment possible. And that's what I'm talking about, the energy at the table. The players just rolled a 100, and then now they rolled a bad effect on a 100. What could that be? And they actually won't know what it would be, because behind the screen, only the DM now knows what that bad effect is, and they can hold on to that on a little sticky note, write it down, and at the worst timing possible, trigger it. Again, this ties in everything I've been talking about the duration, the trigger, the delay. When does it happen? This is a great example of that. And as you could probably guess, if you roll the good effect, the same thing happens, but in a good way, where you roll the effect, the Dungeon Master sees what the cool, good effect would be, and maybe even maxes out that good effect and has it be something permanent. That's what I would give a tip to Dungeon Masters for, but it would trigger at the best time possible. And for that middle effect, they'd roll a D100 and see what the neutral result was for that, and trigger that whenever they wanted to at a funny time or whatever was cool. And that's not lazy writing on my part, that's purposeful, and to have this thing be something fun and exciting for you to implement at your game table. And I gotta give you at least a hint on what a nat 1 on the D100 would be, and it has to do with some shape-shifting into a dragon, either a good one you can control or a bad one that starts to attack your party. Timeout. I know I've said it before, but literally none of this would be possible without my support over on Patreon. The extra support that I get goes into helping pay people to make PDFs, help me edit videos, have more time to create. Because as a full-time teacher, coach, newborn dad, husband, I have very limited time, and the resources that I get help me have more time and bring in more people to help me do this thing so I can create more stuff for you guys. So big shout out to Gravekeeper, who's my newest Ancient Dragon patron, which is a huge level of support every single month. And this is really cool, and this is the first time that this has happened. I started Patreon 1 year ago in January. Since then, I've gone from 0 patrons to over 300 now, and like I said, is how I'm able to do this thing and eventually do it full time. But there are 6 people out there who are the true OG supporters of this channel that have been around on Patreon for a full year. Here they are: Solar FM, Paul Cave, Sven Sprite, Scatterbug, Jacob Lee, and Brazen Chase. Thank you so much for this much support for this long. It's people like you who will eventually make this thing become possible full time, because Patreon is the only way that I could do that. So big thank you to you 6 and all the new patrons we've had join recently from all these new PDFs. I'm going to keep them coming and keep blowing your socks off every single time. Okay, I hope you're sharing this excitement that I have for Wild Magic Surge. You see some of the issues in the rules as written, what I've done to try and homebrew fix it for myself, and how I run off any Wild Magic Surge table at my table. And if you want to pick my personal table up for yourself, link to Patreon's right here, and I got a bunch of other videos for you right here. So until next time, stay creative and think outside that wild box. Peace.